I grew up in Arizona but moved to New Mexico for work a few years ago. I love camping and have spent a lot of time in the desert, so I'm not easily scared by the wilderness. But this trip changed how I see the outdoors forever. It was late September, and the weather was perfect. Not too hot during the day and cool at night. I had a 3-day weekend and wanted to get out of the city, so I packed up my gear and drove about 3 hours northwest of Albuquerque to a remote area near the Jemez Mountains. It wasn't a popular camping spot, which is exactly what I wanted. No tourists, no loud groups. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of the desert. I reached the area around mid-afternoon, parked my truck on a dirt trail, and hiked about 2 miles in. The terrain was mostly flat with scattered juniper trees and dry brush. In the distance, the hills rolled up into red rock formations. It was beautiful but desolate. I set up my tent near a small, dried-up creek bed and started a fire as the sun began to set. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, watched the stars, and listened to the distant sound of coyotes howling. I've heard them plenty of times before, but something about their cries that night felt off. It wasn't just the usual yipping and howling. There was something else, pattern to it, almost like words. I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was imagining things. But even as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I woke up early, made some coffee, and decided to go for a short hike before it got too hot. The land stretched out endlessly, untouched and empty. But as I walked further from camp, I noticed something strange. Tracks. Not animal tracks, not human either. They were deep, like something heavy had walked through. The shape was wrong, like a human footprint but longer, distorted. Almost like someone had been walking on all fours. I knelt down and examined them. They led from the brush toward the general direction of my camp but stopped suddenly, as if whatever made them had just disappeared. A chill ran through me. The ground was dry and dusty. There was no way the tracks could just stop like that. I looked around, trying to find where they continued, but they were just gone. I felt exposed standing there, like I was being watched. I slowly turned in a circle, scanning the area, but I saw nothing, just the endless desert. I forced myself to shake it off and headed back to camp. By late afternoon, I was feeling better. I spent the day exploring and didn't see anything else weird. I convinced myself the tracks had been an animal, maybe distorted by the wind or erosion. As the sun started to set, I built another fire and sat down to eat. That's when I smelled it, a horrible, rotten stench, like something dead and baking in the sun. Came out of nowhere, thick and sour, making my stomach turn. I stood up and looked around, trying to find the source, but the smell seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was strong, overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The silence that followed felt unnatural. The desert is never truly silent. There's always the rustle of wind, the distant call of an animal. But at that moment, everything had stopped. No wind.
No insects. No distant coyotes.
Nothing. I felt my skin crawl. Something was out there. Something was close. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The beam cut through the night, but I saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just outside my vision, watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I forced myself to lie down in my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept listening, waiting. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. It was close. I held my breath, listening. The sound circled my camp, stopping, starting again. Then came the worst part. A voice. It was low, broken, like someone trying to speak but not knowing how. It came from just beyond my tent, whispering my name. It was my voice. I felt frozen, unable to move. My own voice calling out from the darkness. It was impossible. The whispering stopped, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the exhaustion won, and I must have passed out. I woke up at dawn, disoriented and on edge. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. But when I stepped outside my tent, I saw them. More tracks. They circled my camp, leading up to the door of my tent, then stopping. Like whatever it was had been standing right outside, watching me sleep. I packed up in record time, shoving my gear into my pack without bothering to organize it. As I hoisted my bag onto my back, that stench returned, stronger this time. I didn't look back. I hiked to my truck as fast as I could, ignoring the feeling that something was just behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I saw it, a figure standing at the tree line, too tall, its limbs too long, watching. I drove without stopping, without looking back again. I didn't breathe normally until I was miles away. I never went back to that area. For weeks, I felt like something was still watching me. Even in my apartment, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced something was outside my window. I don't know what I saw in that desert, but I know it wasn't human, and I know it wasn't alone. I never planned on camping alone in a forgotten part of the countryside, especially not in the middle of a storm, but sometimes life just pushes you into strange places. It was late September, and I had taken a week off work to escape the city. I just wanted some time to myself, no emails, no traffic, no people. I had picked the West Midlands, an area known for its rolling hills and old forests, but I hadn't realized just how isolated some parts could be. I had read about an abandoned campsite in an old hiking book, a place that had once been popular in the 1980s but had been shut down due to financial issues. It was supposed to be just off a trail near the Wire Forest, not too far from Kidderminster. I liked the idea of it, somewhere remote but with enough history to make it interesting. When I arrived, the sky was already darkening with thick, gray clouds. The drive had been longer than expected, mostly due to narrow country roads that seemed to twist endlessly between farmland and trees. My car's GPS lost signal about half an hour before I reached the site, so I had to rely on a printed map. The last stretch was a dirt track, barely wide enough for my car, with deep puddles from earlier rain. When I finally parked at the edge of the old campsite, the place looked exactly as I imagined. Abandoned, overgrown, and forgotten. The entrance sign was still there, though the paint had faded and the wooden posts were rotting at the base. Tall grass had taken over the gravel paths, and the old concrete fire pits were cracked and filled with rainwater. A few wooden structures, likely old storage sheds or communal areas, stood in the distance, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. I set up my tent near what looked like the main clearing. The grass was damp but manageable. As I hammered the last peg into the ground, the wind picked up, shaking the trees and sending a deep chill through the air. The first drops of rain hit my jacket. Within minutes, it became a downpour. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and listened to the rain hammer against the fabric. I wasn't scared, just uncomfortable. I had packed well, dry clothes, a warm sleeping bag, even a small gas stove for tea. It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing night. But then things started to feel off. It began with small noises. First, I thought it was just the rain or the wind shifting the trees. But as I sat there, drinking tea from my thermos, I noticed something different. The sound of footsteps. Not close, not loud, but definitely there. faint crunching through the wet grass, moving slowly, stopping, then starting again. I turned off my flashlight, listening harder. Nothing, just the rain. Maybe it had been my imagination. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in a strange place. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to check outside. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My headlamp cut through the rain, revealing only the wet grass, trees, and the abandoned structures in the distance. No movement, no signs of anyone. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, and crawled back inside, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled through the trees, making the old wooden sheds creak in the distance. I dozed in and out, waking up every time the rain hit harder or the wind shifted. Then, around midnight, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Not footsteps this time, a sound much worse. Breathing. It was right outside my tent. Deep, steady breathing, just inches from the thin fabric separating me from the outside world. I froze. I didn't move. I barely even breathed myself. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving. They were just standing there, breathing. I reached slowly for my headlamp, careful not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I switched it on. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, then unzipped the tent and shined the light outside. Nothing. No footprints in the mud. No movement in the grass. Just the endless rain pouring down. I stayed awake for hours after that, gripping the small camping knife I had packed. Every little sound made my muscles tense. I kept telling myself it had been the wind, my own breathing echoing in my tent, anything but the alternative, that someone had been standing just outside watching me. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I stepped outside, exhausted but needing to see for myself. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The ground was soaked, thick with mud. I walked around my tent, scanning for footprints. That's when I saw them. A set of footprints circling my tent. Deep, fresh, unmistakably human. But that wasn't the worst part. Whoever it was hadn't walked up to my tent from the trees. The footprints only started a few feet away from where I had been sleeping, like they had just appeared there, as if they had been standing still watching for hours. I packed my things in record time. The idea of spending another night there wasn't an option. As I threw my gear into the car, I looked back at the abandoned campsite one last time. The rain had washed away most of the tracks, but I could still see them faintly in the mud. The shape of bare feet. No shoes, no socks. I drove out of there as fast as the muddy roads would allow. A week later, back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been seriously wrong about that place. I searched online for anything about the campsite. Most of what I found were old forum posts and camping blogs, people sharing memories of staying there in the 80s before it shut down. But then I found something else. A news article from 1994. A hiker had gone missing in that exact area. His campsite had been found abandoned, his footprints circling his tent in the mud, just like mine. His car was still parked nearby, untouched. No sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing stolen. They never found him. The search lasted for weeks before they gave up. The only clue? Witnesses from nearby villages claimed they had seen a man walking the roads at night, barefoot. I haven't been camping alone since. I've always liked camping alone. Something about being far from people, away from the sounds of cars and city life, makes me feel calm. I've been doing it for years, and nothing ever really scared me. Sure, I've had weird moments, strange sounds at night, animals getting too close, but I always found a logical reason for everything. That's why, when I look back at what happened, I still struggle to understand how I made it out. This happened in the summer of 2019. I was 32 at the time, and I had taken a week off work just to be out in the woods. I chose a spot in Montana, deep in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. I had done my research, looking at maps and checking for any old trails that weren't too well known. I wanted to be somewhere isolated, somewhere no one else would bother me. I drove for hours, first on paved roads, then onto rough dirt trails. My truck bounced over rocks and potholes, the trees closing in on both sides as I went deeper into the forest. Eventually, I reached a spot that felt right, a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. No signs of other campers, no trash, no old fire pits, just untouched land. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started settling in. The first day went by peacefully. I fished in the stream, cooked my food over the fire, and just enjoyed the silence. As the sun set, I felt completely at ease. But then, around midnight, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was silent. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me from my sleep. That's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate movement just outside my tent. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer sound like, what bears sound like. This was different. It was footsteps, careful, measured, like someone was trying not to be heard. My heart started pounding. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a tree branch had fallen. Maybe I had just dreamed the sound. I forced myself to relax, and somehow I fell back asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been near my tent. Still, I couldn't shake the unease I felt. I spent the day hiking, trying to enjoy myself, but the feeling never really left. That night, I made sure to keep my fire going longer. I stayed up later, listening to the woods, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, I let myself believe that the night before had just been my mind playing tricks on me. But then, around 3 a.m., something woke me again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Low, slow breathing just outside my tent. My stomach clenched. I wanted to move, to reach for my knife, but I was frozen. The breathing was so close I could hear the slight wheeze in it, like whoever or whatever was out there had a problem with their lungs. I forced myself to stay quiet. My tent was zipped up, but the fabric was thin. If someone wanted to get in, nothing would stop them. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, just listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, my hands shaking. I looked around, but once again, there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I decided to stay one more night. Looking back, I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to believe that something was really wrong. Maybe I was too stubborn to leave. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but by the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. I kept my fire burning bright, my knife within reach. I told myself that if I heard anything again, I would leave at first light. Then, just past midnight, I heard something new. It was a voice. It was distant at first, carried by the wind. A man's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was getting closer. Then I realized something that made my skin crawl. There was no emotion in the voice, no rise or fall, just flat, empty words. And whoever was speaking wasn't answering anyone. There was only one voice. It stopped suddenly, cutting off mid-sentence. The silence that followed was worse. I gripped my knife, my whole body tense. Then, from just beyond the light of my fire, I heard something new. Laughter. Low, quiet laughter. Then the footsteps started. Slow, deliberate steps, just like the first night. moving closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it into the trees. Nothing, but the footsteps kept coming. I grabbed my keys, unzipped my tent, and bolted for my truck. I didn't care about my gear. I just ran. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights flashed across the trees, and that's when I saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, skinny, and dressed in old, ragged clothes. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth was open slightly, like he had just been laughing. Then, as my headlights hit him, he turned and walked back into the trees. Not running, not hiding, just walking. I didn't stay to see where he went. I threw my truck into reverse, spun around, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I sat there, shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I never went back for my gear. I don't know who he was. Maybe some hermit living in the woods. Maybe something worse. All I know is that I was completely alone, miles from anyone, and somehow he had found me. It was the middle of August when my wife, Rachel, her mother, and I decided to go camping in the mountains. We'd been planning the trip for months. It was going to be a relaxing few days in nature. No phone service, just the sound of the trees and the crackling of a campfire. The plan was to camp in a secluded spot by a small lake, far enough away from the nearest trail to avoid the usual weekend crowds. The weather forecast looked perfect, warm during the day and cool at night. We were excited, but things didn't turn out the way we expected. We packed our gear in the SUV the night before, making sure we had everything: tents, sleeping bags, food, and a cooler full of drinks. Rachel's mom, Sharon, was in her late 50s, a bit more cautious than Rachel and I, but still adventurous for her age. Rachel and I were both in our early 30s, and we all shared the same idea of getting away from the noise of the city and into the stillness of the forest. The drive up the mountain was peaceful, with the sun rising behind us, casting a soft glow over the winding roads. The trees were thick on either side of the narrow path, and as we got further from civilization, the air smelled cleaner, fresher. We talked, joked, and planned for the days ahead. We arrived at the campsite around noon, just as the sun was hitting its peak. The spot we'd chosen was perfect, right by the water, surrounded by tall pines and a thick underbrush. After setting up camp, we decided to take a walk around the lake. Rachel and Sharon were already chatting about the best fishing spots, while I tried to take in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the wind rustling the trees and the distant call of birds. We walked for about an hour, following the shoreline, until we found a small clearing. The ground was soft and moss-covered, and there was a log to sit on near the water's edge. We stopped there for a while, enjoying the peace and the beautiful view. But then something caught my eye. Across the lake, at the edge of the trees, I saw movement, something dark and fast darting between the trunks. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it seemed too quick and too low to the ground to be a person. I didn't say anything right away, not wanting to spook Rachel or her mom. Maybe it was a deer or a bear, something I could easily explain away. We eventually made our way back to camp, where we spent the rest of the afternoon lounging and preparing dinner. The air cooled down as the sun dipped behind the mountains, and we lit a small campfire. Sharon made some hot dogs, while Rachel and I opened a couple of beers and enjoyed the warmth from the fire. The evening was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept thinking about that strange movement across the lake. As night fell, we all went to bed early. The sky was clear, and the stars above were brighter than I'd seen in years. Rachel and I shared a tent, and her mom had her own. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. I fell asleep quickly, but I woke up just past midnight, feeling restless. I lay there for a while, staring at the inside of the tent. Then, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from just outside. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something smaller moving through the campsite. But then, I heard a rustling sound near the entrance of the tent, followed by a low, scraping noise, as if something had brushed against the canvas. My heart began to race. I carefully unzipped the tent, just a crack, and peeked out. The fire was out, but there was a faint glow from the stars. The campsite was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't see anything unusual, but my instincts were telling me that something wasn't right. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept listening, waiting for any sound that would tell me I was just imagining things. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened to Rachel or Sharon. They were still asleep when I got up, and I didn't want to alarm them. I spent some time checking the campsite, making sure everything was secure, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been nearby. We spent the rest of the day fishing and hiking. We didn't talk much about the weird feeling I had the night before, but it lingered in my mind. In the afternoon, we decided to hike further into the woods, away from the lake. The path was rougher here, and we had to be careful not to trip on the uneven ground. Rachel was ahead of me, her mom bringing up the rear, when I suddenly heard something snap behind us, like a twig breaking, loud and sharp. I stopped, holding my breath. Rachel turned around, looking confused. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I just shook my head. I didn't want to sound paranoid. We continued hiking, but the unsettling feeling returned. It was like someone was following us, keeping just out of sight. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, always too quick to identify. But Rachel and Sharon didn't seem to notice. The woods were dense, and the afternoon light was fading fast. We decided to head back to camp before it got too dark. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky was deep blue, and the air was getting colder. As I was setting up the fire, Rachel went to grab more wood from the pile we'd gathered earlier. I watched her go and then heard a voice behind me. "You've been acting strange today," Sharon said quietly. "Is everything okay?" I wasn't sure how to answer. I didn't want to scare her or Rachel, but something was definitely off. "I don't know," I said after a pause. I don't like how quiet it is here. It feels like we're being watched." Sharon didn't seem convinced. "You're probably just tired. It's been a long couple of days." That night, I couldn't sleep again. The noises from the forest were more persistent now. Scratching at the tents, footsteps around the camp. I was about to get up and check things out when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low and distant, calling from the trees. It wasn't a human voice, not really. It was more like a growl, mixed with a soft, rasping sound, as if whatever was making it couldn't quite speak. It was coming from the far side of the camp, near the lake. My heart pounded, and I froze, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to wake Rachel or Sharon, but I couldn't ignore the sound. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. I finally decided to get up and check it out. Quietly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was damp, and the ground felt soft under my boots. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, its beam cutting through the dark. I moved cautiously toward the lake, trying to be as quiet as possible, but the crunch of the leaves under my feet sounded unnaturally loud. As I reached the water's edge, I stopped. The noise had stopped too. The entire forest was still. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the rustling of trees and the gentle lapping of the water. But then I saw it. A figure, hunched low and moving quickly along the shore, darted between the trees. It was too fast, too strange to be a person. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my legs go weak. I took a step back, my foot landing on a rock, and the sound broke the silence. The figure froze, and for a split second, I saw its eyes, wide and reflective in the moonlight. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. I ran back to camp, my heart racing, adrenaline flooding my system. I didn't stop until I was back inside the tent with Rachel and Sharon, but I didn't say anything. Couldn't. The next morning, we packed up and left. We didn't stay for another night. As we drove down the mountain, I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following us through the trees. We never spoke about what happened in the woods, but the memory stayed with me, haunting me. I'm not sure what I saw that night, but I know this. Something was out there with us, and it wasn't friendly. It was a quiet evening when I decided to camp alone on an old, forgotten farm on the outskirts of town. I was 28 years old, and after a few hectic weeks, I needed to clear my head. The farm had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. My parents had told me stories about it when I was younger. They'd warned me that the place had a creepy reputation, especially with its eerie graveyard that sat near the back of the land. But I wasn't one to shy away from a bit of unsettling atmosphere. The idea of spending the night in such a place, far from the noise of the city, seemed perfect. The drive there was long, filled with narrow, winding roads. As I got closer, the terrain changed from the usual suburban sprawl to wild, untamed fields. I passed a few dilapidated houses, their structures sagging under the weight of time. The sun was beginning to set by the time I arrived, casting a golden glow on everything around me. It gave the whole place a feeling of being stuck in time, like it was from a forgotten era. The farm had an old stone wall that ran around its perimeter, with gaps in it where nature had slowly taken over. Tall grass and thorny bushes grew in every direction. There was a large barn, its roof collapsed in on itself, and a crumbling farmhouse at the end of the field. The graveyard, as expected, was just beyond the barn. It was barely visible at first, hidden behind some trees and overgrown bushes. I felt a strange pull toward it, but pushed the thought aside. I wasn't there for the graveyard, just to get some peace and solitude. I parked my truck at the edge of the farm near a small clearing and set up camp. The campfire crackled as I dug a small pit and piled the dry wood I had brought. The sound of the fire and the wind rustling through the trees was oddly calming. There was something beautiful about how quiet it was. No cars, no people, just the sounds of nature and the occasional distant caw of a crow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself in a jacket, sipping on a flask of warm tea. I had no phone signal out here, but I didn't mind. The isolation felt freeing in a way. I glanced at the dark outline of the barn, where the graveyard was nearby. It was probably just a bunch of old, forgotten graves, but there was something unsettling about it. I had always been curious about what lay there, but the thought of walking through that silent cemetery made my skin crawl. Night fell completely, and the stars emerged, shining brightly in the pitch-black sky. The moon was just a sliver, barely casting any light. The firelight flickered, throwing shadows that seemed to dance around the clearing. After a while, I felt like I could relax, but the feeling that I was being watched started to creep in. I told myself it was just the quiet of the night playing tricks on my mind. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, just beyond the campfire's glow. I turned sharply toward it, expecting to see an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but there was nothing. The sound stopped, leaving an uncomfortable stillness in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked slowly toward the barn. I wasn't sure why I felt drawn to it, but the unease was building up inside me. I approached the barn, the wooden beams creaking as I stepped closer. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, landing on the old stone foundation. The barn had been abandoned for years, but it didn't seem as dilapidated as the farmhouse. There was a strange sense of stillness around it, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to return. The rustling sound came again, closer this time. My heart started to race, but I ignored the fear rising in my chest and walked further into the dark. As I neared the graveyard, I noticed the faint outlines of headstones peeking through the thick underbrush. Some were toppled over, others barely visible under layers of moss. I couldn't tell how old they were, but the place had an air of neglect, like no one had been here in decades. I shone my flashlight over the gravestones. They looked weathered, but there was something about the names carved into the stone that sent a chill down my spine. Some were completely illegible, others half erased by time. But what caught my attention was one stone in particular. It was newer than the rest. It didn't belong here, almost like someone had recently placed it. The name on it was something I couldn't quite make out. My flashlight flickered as I leaned in closer to examine it. As I did, I heard a soft thud behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the wind blowing through the trees. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That was when I realized how completely alone I was. The silence of the night was overwhelming, and the air had turned heavy. I stood there for a moment, torn between staying to figure out what was going on and running back to my camp. My feet felt like they were frozen to the ground, and for the first time since I arrived, I was genuinely afraid. The rustling came again, louder this time, but there was no animal in sight. The air felt colder, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone out here. My flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely. I quickly checked the batteries, but they seemed fine. The feeling of being watched intensified, and it was as if the whole farm was alive, watching my every move. I turned and started walking back toward the clearing. The graveyard was silent again, but the eerie sense of presence lingered. The campfire was still burning when I returned, but the shadows seemed longer now, stretching further than they should have. I tried to push the unsettling feeling out of my mind and sat back down by the fire. The wind started to pick up, causing the trees to sway and creak in the distance. The fire crackled loudly in the quiet, and I stared at the dancing flames. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the noises were just animals in the night. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard it again, a loud thud, much closer this time, like something large hitting the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up quickly, scanning the area around the fire. Everything seemed still, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. I grabbed my flashlight again and shone it toward the barn, the graveyard, the dark corners of the clearing, but nothing. Nothing except the trees, the dark, and the flickering light of the campfire. Then, as I was about to sit back down, I noticed something odd. There, just at the edge of the firelight, was a figure, a shadow. I froze. It was tall and indistinct, but its outline was unmistakable. It wasn't human, not really. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin. It seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways, as if it were shifting with the wind. My flashlight shone directly on it, but the figure vanished in an instant, like smoke dissolving into the night. My heart was pounding in my chest. I thought about running, but I didn't know where I'd go. I was surrounded by darkness, and the farm seemed to stretch on forever. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of dread continued to claw at me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside the firelight seemed amplified. Each rustle, each creak of the trees, felt like something was coming closer. I barely moved, only watching the dark edges of the camp, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. The farm looked different in the daylight. The graveyard, which seemed so ominous the night before, was just a forgotten patch of land with weathered stones. The barn, too, looked just like any other old, abandoned structure, but the feeling of unease remained. I didn't stay long after that. I left the farm as quickly as I could, but the memory of the strange events lingered. I tried to rationalize it all, telling myself it was just the isolation and the darkness playing with my mind. But I knew deep down that something on that farm had been watching me. Something had been waiting, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to know what it was. As I drove away, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the outline of the barn against the sky. I didn't look back again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend away to disconnect, clear my head, and enjoy the solitude of nature. I needed a break from the noise of city life, work, stress, the constant hum of everything. So, I packed up my gear, grabbed my truck, and headed to a remote campsite near the base of the mountains. The area was off the beaten path, which was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, peaceful, just me and the trees. The drive up was smooth. I passed a few small towns along the way, each one feeling more like a memory than a present reality. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The place had been recommended to me by a friend, and from the looks of it, it was perfect. There were no other campers around, just wide open spaces surrounded by thick woods. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. I set up camp quickly. My tent was a two-person job, but I figured it would be perfect for just me. I had a small campfire going, and as the sun dipped lower, I could already feel the temperature drop. I cooked myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just some beans and a hot dog, but it tasted amazing in the silence. It was so quiet that even the crackling of the fire seemed like a loud noise. As night fell, I made sure to keep the fire burning. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I loved the darkness, but in a place like this, being cautious felt like the smart move. There were stories of animals around, not to mention the possibility of someone else being out there. It didn't sit right with me, the thought of another person just lurking in the woods. I kept my knife close, just in case. Hours passed. I sat back against a log, letting the firelight dance across my face. I hadn't heard anything from the wildlife, not even a rustling in the bushes. Just when I was beginning to relax, I heard it, a low, almost rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere in the woods. At first, I figured it was just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or something like that, but the tapping didn't stop. It went on for too long and it felt off, not natural. I stood up, instinctively grabbing the flashlight that was hanging from my backpack. The beam cut through the darkness, but the only thing I saw was the dense forest surrounding me. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier, thicker, like the night was holding its breath. I decided to stay by the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. For the first time, I felt an odd discomfort, like someone or something was watching me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was there, lingering. My mind raced, thinking of all the stories you hear about in places like this. Campers disappearing, strange things happening in the woods. I told myself it was all nonsense, just my nerves playing tricks on me. The night stretched on. At some point, the fire was reduced to a few glowing embers, and the air had grown colder. I figured it was time to turn in. I put out the fire, careful not to leave any trace behind. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I kept the flashlight beside me, unsure if I would be able to sleep at all. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing that tapping noise, faint but persistent, like it was right outside my tent. It would stop for a moment, then start again in the same rhythm. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I thought I heard the faint crunch of footsteps. Someone walking through the dry leaves, maybe. But when I unzipped the tent and peeked out, the woods were empty, still, and dark. I went back to my bag, telling myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. There was something deliberate about it. I held my breath, straining to listen, but there was nothing, just the deep silence of the woods. The next morning, I woke up late, the sun already high in the sky. My mind was tired, my nerves frayed, but I forced myself out of the tent. The world outside was peaceful, calm. The birds were chirping, the air fresh. I felt a little foolish for getting so worked up the night before. Maybe I just wasn't used to being alone in the woods. I spent the day hiking, walking deeper into the forest, hoping the exercise would clear my head. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake that feeling. The woods were beautiful, but they felt like they were hiding something, like there was a secret buried somewhere deep in the trees. That evening, I returned to my campsite. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The area around my tent looked disturbed. The dirt was churned up, like someone had been walking around it. But I was alone. My truck was still parked in the same spot, the only sign of life. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe an animal had wandered through, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. As night fell again, I sat by the campfire, watching the flames dance. This time, I couldn't shake the fear creeping into my chest. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees felt like a warning. And then, there it was again, the tapping sound, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was faint, almost distant, but it was unmistakable. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up. The sound was closer now, much closer. It was rhythmic, and now I could hear it, like a hammer hitting wood. Tap, tap, tap. I made my way toward the source of the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of the flashlight cut through the trees, but all I saw was the darkness, thick and oppressive. The tapping continued, louder now, almost deafening. Then I saw it, a figure, a man or something resembling one, standing among the trees. He was tall, his features hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, unable to move. The tapping stopped suddenly. A deep silence followed, and for a moment, everything was still. The figure stepped forward, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. In his hands was a hammer, the one that had been making that awful sound. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran, my legs burning with the effort. I didn't look back. The sounds of footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. I ran through the woods, branches slapping at my face, my heart in my throat. My only thought was to get back to my truck, to get out of there. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps never stopped. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on me. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and without thinking, I sped out of the campsite, not daring to look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, and by then, the sun was starting to rise. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking. I was terrified, but I didn't know who to talk to, what to say. The woods had felt alive with something that shouldn't have been there. I haven't gone back to those woods since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that tapping sound. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel like someone is watching me, waiting for the moment when I'm alone in the woods again. I remember the summer of 2016 like it was yesterday. It was a time when I thought I knew everything about camping, enough to avoid surprises. I was 28 at the time, a couple of years into a job that kept me tied to a desk most days. But that weekend, I was going camping with my brother, Mike, and a couple of our friends. We didn't know it then, but that trip would change the way I looked at the outdoors forever. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, do some fishing, and maybe hike a bit if the mood struck us. We picked a spot near a lake, deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far enough off the beaten path that we wouldn't have to deal with too many other campers. The lake itself was supposed to be peaceful, a place where fish were plentiful, the kind of place where you could spend hours in a boat without a single care. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. The air was thick with the smell of pine, the kind of scent that seemed to cleanse everything. We set up camp quickly, tents up, the fire pit dug, and fishing rods prepared. I could feel the excitement buzzing through the air, the thrill of escaping the monotony of daily life. We didn't even notice the quiet at first, the kind of silence that comes when you're miles away from civilization. It was only later that we'd realize how much that silence meant. The first few hours were perfect. We fished, laughed, and joked around. Mike caught a decent-sized bass, and we threw it back, laughing about how we'd catch the big one the next day. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The sky above us was clear, stars spread out like 1,000 little diamonds. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds and a slight chill in the air. The others were already up, preparing for another day of fishing. I felt that same rush of excitement, the kind you only get when you're out in the wild with no one to answer to but nature. Mike and I decided to take the boat out on the lake for a few hours, while the others fished from the shore. The lake was eerily calm as we paddled out, the only sounds coming from the gentle slap of the oars against the water. I couldn't help but notice how still everything felt. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only people in the world. We joked about how creepy it was, but I didn't think much of it at the time. You get used to that kind of silence when you're camping in the middle of nowhere. We fished for a couple of hours without much luck. Nothing more than a few small perch, nothing worth keeping. When we turned back toward the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the way the trees stood around the lake, tall and silent, watching us. I tried to laugh it off, blaming the quiet for making me feel uneasy, but something didn't feel right. Back at camp, the others were still fishing by the shore. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual. We joined them, casting our lines into the water and trying to get a decent catch before we had to pack up and head home. As the sun began to set, we made plans to start cooking dinner. That's when we heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A crack, like a branch breaking, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Everyone stopped what they were doing, staring into the trees. For a moment, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded too deliberate, like someone or something was stepping through the forest. I tried to brush it off, but the others were looking around nervously. We all agreed it was probably a deer, and we went back to our cooking. But even as we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, a deep darkness fell over the lake. The stars above were almost lost in the vastness of the sky, and the trees loomed over us, their shadows stretching toward the campfire. I was starting to feel an unease I couldn't explain. The others were getting sleepy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At around 2 a.m., I decided to step away from the fire and take a walk. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I felt like I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the woods. The night air was cool, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, and that's when I heard it again, that crack. But this time it was closer. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't an animal. It was something or someone moving through the woods deliberately, slowly. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another camper, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I turned back toward camp, but before I could take a step, I heard something else. A voice. It wasn't clear, but it sounded like it was calling out, like someone was whispering my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark woods, but I saw nothing. The light cut through the darkness, but there was no movement, no sign of life. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't explain it, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. Something or someone was out there, watching me. I turned and made my way back to camp as quickly as I could, the feeling of being followed growing with each step. When I got back to the campfire, everyone was still asleep in their tents. I sat by the fire, trying to calm myself, but my mind wouldn't let go of the feeling. I kept hearing faint sounds, cracking branches, the soft rustle of leaves, like something was moving just outside the circle of light. But every time I shined the flashlight toward the woods, nothing was there. The next morning, we packed up and headed home, all of us uneasy but trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. As we were leaving, we noticed something strange. The ground around our campsite was disturbed, like something heavy had been moving through the brush, right up to the edge of the camp. But the thing that made my stomach drop was the fact that there were no footprints, nothing to show where whatever it was had come from. We didn't talk much about it on the way home. Maybe it was just a bear, or maybe it was nothing at all. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us, watching, waiting, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for someone else to come too close. That trip, that feeling of being watched, stayed with me. I never went back to that lake, never even drove close to it. Something about that place felt wrong. I don't know what it was, and maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. The woods are not as empty as they seem. And sometimes, they hold secrets you don't want to uncover. I was 34 when it happened. The year was 2018, and I had been camping alone for over a decade. It wasn't something I did for social media or bragging rights. I just enjoyed the quiet. No cell service, no traffic, no artificial lights. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. That fall, I decided to head up to Devil's Ridge, a remote section of the Appalachian wilderness in Tennessee. I had camped there twice before and liked how secluded it was. No designated campsites, no marked trails, just a vast stretch of forest with rugged terrain. Most people stayed away because it was easy to get lost, and the local stories didn't help. Hunters talked about strange noises, missing dogs, things like that. I never put much stock in those kinds of tales. The only real dangers out there were the ones you could see: bears, cougars, and the occasional lunatic. I packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, a knife, a .357 revolver, just in case, and enough food for 4 days. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by a creek I knew, and enjoy the solitude. I parked my truck at an old logging road and hiked in about 6 miles. The air smelled like damp leaves, and the ground was soft from recent rain. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. That was one of my favorite parts of the wilderness. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. By late afternoon, I reached the creek. The water was clear and shallow, running over smooth stones. I set up camp about 30 yards from the bank, close enough for easy water access but far enough to stay dry if it rained. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate some beef jerky, and listened to the night sounds. Gulls, crickets, the occasional rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. Nothing unusual, but on the second night things changed. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was dark. I listened. The forest had gone still. Too still.
No crickets.
No wind. Just silence. Then I heard it. ***, a single, deliberate step, ***. Not an animal scurrying through the leaves, but the weight of something big pressing into the earth. It came from the trees behind my tent, maybe 40 feet away. I stayed still, my hand moving slowly toward my knife. I held my breath, listening. Another step, closer, then another. I wasn't new to this kind of situation. Could have been a bear, but bears tend to move with more noise. A cougar? Unlikely. They're stealthy but don't just walk up to people. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing, just silence. I eventually convinced myself it was a deer or some other large animal passing through. I forced myself to relax and, after a while, drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my camp. The ground was damp, making it easy to see tracks. I expected to find deer prints or maybe bear tracks. I found neither. What I saw made my stomach tighten. ***, boot prints ***. Someone had walked up to my camp in the middle of the night and stood there, watching. I wasn't about to pack up and leave over a few footprints, but I wasn't going to ignore them either. Could have been a lost hiker, maybe a hunter who wandered too close. Either way, I kept my revolver on me for the rest of the day. I spent the afternoon hiking farther upstream. I found a few old animal trails and followed them for a while, but didn't see much. A few deer, some squirrels. The forest was thick, the air damp with the smell of moss and wet earth. As the sun started to dip, I turned back. I wasn't about to be out there in the dark. When I got back to camp, something felt off. My firewood pile was scattered. My gear looked like it had been moved. Nothing was missing, but things weren't how I left them. That night, I kept my gun within reach. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing sounds, small noises, like someone moving carefully through the trees. Not an animal crashing through the brush, but something deliberate, careful. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line. A shape, tall, human. But when I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, there was nothing there. I stayed awake until dawn. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up my gear and started hiking back. About 2 miles from camp, I spotted something odd. ***, a narrow path leading uphill ***, one I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. After about 15 minutes, the path led to a cave entrance. It wasn't deep, maybe 20 feet, with a low ceiling. But what made me stop was what was inside. A sleeping bag, a dirty, torn-up one. Scattered around were empty food cans, a rusted hunting knife, and bones. Small ones, probably from rabbits or squirrels. Someone had been living out here. Someone who had walked up to my camp at night. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. I made it back to my truck by late afternoon. But as I was tossing my pack into the bed, I noticed something. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. My stomach dropped. I looked inside. My gear was still there. My keys were still in the cup holder. But on the seat was something that hadn't been there before. A single muddy handprint. I got in, locked the doors, and drove the hell out of there. I never went back to Devil's Ridge. I don't know who was out there. A drifter? Some lunatic living off the grid? Maybe just a hunter who didn't like me on his land. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, moving through the trees at night, getting close to my tent. And at some point, probably while I was out hiking that last day, they had been inside my truck. I still camp, still love the wilderness, but I don't go out alone anymore. Some places are better left alone. I have always liked the quiet. I grew up in a small town where people knew each other, where life moved slow. I became a cop not for the excitement, but for the steady routine. The job was simple most of the time: petty crime, drunks, the occasional fight that got out of hand. Nothing big ever happened, and that was fine with me. It was late September 2018 when I decided to take a short camping trip. I had 3 days off and I wanted to get away from everything. Just me, my truck, and the woods. I had been working a lot of night shifts, and the city noise was getting to me. I wanted the silence, the kind that only deep forests could give. I picked a place about 3 hours away from town, a national park with miles of trails and barely any visitors this time of year. The summer crowd was gone, and the cold autumn wind kept most people away. That was perfect for me. I packed light, just the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, my rifle, and my old hunting knife. The rain was supposed to start in the evening, but I didn't mind. I liked the rain. I got there around noon. The road leading into the park was empty, just gravel and mud stretching through the trees. The forest was thick, dark even in the daylight. The leaves were turning red and yellow, but the sky was gray, making everything look dull. I drove down a narrow dirt road until I found a spot far from the main trail. No campsites, no people, just trees and silence. I set up my tent near a small clearing, close to the tree-line where the ground was flat. The air smelled like damp earth, like wet leaves and pine. I took my time gathering firewood, stacking it neatly beside the pit I dug out with my boot. The wind was picking up, and I could feel the chill sinking into my jacket. By the time the rain started, I had a small fire going. It crackled quietly as the first drops hit the flames, sizzling for a moment before turning to steam. I sat on a fallen log, eating cold beans from a can, watching the fire flicker. The rain was steady but not heavy, just enough to make the night feel colder. I wasn't worried. I had camped alone plenty of times before. I had my rifle loaded, my knife strapped to my belt. Out here, the only real danger was a bear or maybe a hungry cougar. But even that was rare. They usually stayed away from people. Still, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. The woods were quiet, but not the normal kind of quiet. There were no owls, no crickets, no rustling in the bushes. Just the sound of rain tapping against my tent and the faint hiss of the fire struggling to stay lit. I tried to ignore it. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and listened to the rain. The ground was cold, even through the tarp, and the wind made the trees groan. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but close, a soft crunch, footsteps, not an animal, too slow, too deliberate. Someone was walking through the woods. I stayed still, listening. The rain made it hard to tell how far away they were. A few yards? 50? More? I reached for my rifle, my fingers curling around the stock. My breathing was slow, steady, but my heart was beating hard. Who the hell would be out here in this weather? The footsteps stopped. Silence. I held my breath. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the rain. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. A full minute. Nothing. I stayed awake for a long time, gripping my rifle under my sleeping bag, but the sound never came back. Eventually, I drifted off. A loud snap woke me. I sat up fast, heart hammering. The fire was out. The inside of my tent was pitch black. My breath was fogging in the cold air. I listened. Something was outside. A twig breaking. A slow, shuffling sound. I gripped my rifle, my other hand reaching for my knife. My mind was racing. It had to be an animal. Had to be. I waited. The sound moved. Not toward me. Around me. Circling. I swallowed hard, keeping my breath steady. I wasn't new to fear. I had felt it before on the job. But this was different. This wasn't a drunk waving a knife. This wasn't some kid high out of his mind. This was something I couldn't see. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. The rain had stopped. The forest was thick with mist, white fog curling through the trees. My truck was about 50 yards away, parked on the dirt path. Felt farther. I needed to move. I unzipped the tent slowly, making as little noise as possible. I stepped out, rifle up, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. Footprints. Deep, fresh, leading from the treeline to my campsite. Then nothing. No tracks leading away. Whoever had been here had stood in the same spot for God knows how long. Watching. I swallowed hard. The air felt thick, heavy in my chest. I forced myself to breathe slow, quiet. I turned toward my truck, gripping my rifle tight. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not words, just a sound. A breath in the dark. I didn't wait. I moved fast, boots crunching the wet ground, eyes scanning the mist. I kept my rifle ready, every nerve in my body on edge. The truck was close. 10 yards. 5. I reached the door, yanked it open. Something moved in the trees. I didn't look. I jumped in, slammed the door, locked it. The engine roared to life, my headlights cutting through the fog. For a second, I thought I saw something standing just beyond the treeline. A shape, tall, still. Then it was gone. I threw the truck in reverse, tires spinning in the mud, then tore down the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was nothing but darkness in my rearview mirror. I never went back, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when it rains, I think about that night, about the footprints that never led away, about the whisper in the dark, and I wonder if it's still out there. I was never much of a camper. Grew up in the suburbs, spent most of my time inside. But after moving to Australia in my late 20s, I figured I should at least try to experience the outdoors. Everyone I met raved about camping, how peaceful it was, how good it felt to be disconnected from everything. So, after months of putting it off, I finally decided to go. I picked a remote spot in the Northern Territory, about 2 hours from any real town. A national park, thick with eucalyptus trees, red dirt roads, and barely any phone signal. It was far enough from civilization that I'd get the full experience, but close enough that I could drive back if things got too rough. I packed light, a one-person tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a knife, a few cans of food, and plenty of water. I wasn't experienced enough to hunt or fish, so I had to rely on what I brought. My plan was simple: drive out in the morning, set up camp by noon, explore a bit, cook dinner, and get some sleep under the stars. It sounded easy enough. The drive was long and empty, just me and the occasional road train roaring past. The deeper I went, the more the land stretched out, flat, dry, endless. Trees clumped together in patches, some areas so thick you couldn't see through them. Others were just vast plains of nothing but dirt and shrubs. I reached the campsite just before noon. It was exactly how I imagined it. Quiet, isolated, untouched. There was an old fire pit, probably left by another camper, but no signs of anyone around. I set up my tent near a small clearing close to a tree line. Enough shade to stay cool, but not so deep that I'd be completely swallowed by the bush. The first few hours were fine. I walked around, took a few photos, tried to enjoy the quiet. There was something calming about being out there. No cars, no people. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, the occasional bird, and the distant hum of insects. But as the sun started to set, I began to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a weird feeling in my stomach, a little bit of unease, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I tried to ignore it, gathered some wood, and started a fire. I ate my canned food straight out of the tin, watching the flames flicker as the darkness closed in. The sky turned deep blue, then black, stars scattered across it like dust. The fire crackled, sending little embers into the air. The night was still, too still. I expected to hear something, crickets, possums, maybe even a dingo in the distance. But there was nothing, just dead silence. That's when I heard it. A crunch, a slow, deliberate step on dry leaves, somewhere behind my tent. I froze, listening. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a kangaroo, maybe a wallaby. But something about the sound wasn't right. It was too careful. Not like an animal hopping or sniffing around. It was slow, heavy, measured. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it towards the trees. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but trunks and branches. No movement, no glowing eyes, just empty bush. I swallowed hard and turned back to the fire. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I gripped my knife and stood up. The firelight cast long shadows, flickering against the trees. I scanned the darkness, waiting. My breath felt too loud. My skin prickled. A shape moved between the trees. Not fast, not sudden, just there. At first, I thought it was a person. Tall, thin, standing too still. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. Its limbs were too long, its posture too stiff. The head was tilted slightly, like it was listening. A branch snapped under its foot, and then it stepped forward. My stomach dropped. The light caught its face, or what should have been a face. It was wrong. Like someone had tried to copy a human but didn't quite understand how. The skin was stretched too tight, the mouth just a little too wide. The eyes empty, not animal, not human, just black holes in a too pale face. I felt my body go cold. It moved again, slow, deliberate, watching, studying. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my water bottle and threw it as hard as I could. It hit the ground near its feet with a dull thud. For a second, nothing happened. Then it mimicked the sound, a hollow, unnatural thud, like an echo but not quite right. I took a step back, took a step forward. The fire flickered, casting its shifting shape in and out of the shadows. It was close now, too close. I could see the way its skin moved, almost like it wasn't attached properly, like a loose mask over something else. I ran. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just ran. Straight into the bush, away from my tent, away from that thing. Branches scraped my arms, my legs, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. It was following, not running, not chasing, just following, mocking my movements. Every step I took, it took. Every stumble, every heavy breath, it copied me. Perfectly. I don't know how long I ran. Time didn't feel real. It was just me and the sound of my own movements mirrored back at me. But at some point, I saw headlights. A road. A car passing in the distance. I ran harder, burst out of the trees, waving my arms, yelling. The car didn't stop, but it didn't matter. I was close enough to the road now. I sprinted, my lungs burning, until I reached my car. The keys were in my pocket. shaking hands, fumbling. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. Silence, just my own ragged breathing. I turned on the headlights. The trees lit up. The road, my empty campsite in the distance. Nothing else. No movement, no figure, no sound. I didn't wait. I started the engine and drove. Fast, reckless. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. I didn't stop until I reached a motel hours away. Didn't sleep that night. Didn't go back for my tent. I never went camping again. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. Because as I lay awake in that motel bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard something outside my window. A soft, deliberate crunch, and then the sound of my own voice, mocking, repeating, a hollow, unnatural laugh. I was 12 when my grandfather took me camping in the backwoods of Montana. It was the summer of 1997, and he wanted to teach me the things his father had taught him: how to fish, track animals, and make a fire from nothing but what we could find around us. He had been a hunter his whole life, and he knew the forests like the back of his hand. My mother wasn't happy about the idea, but my grandfather insisted that every boy should know how to live off the land. We drove for hours, leaving paved roads behind and moving deep into the wild, where even the dirt paths thinned out. The last town we passed was a tiny place called Red Pine. Nothing but a gas station, a diner, and a bait shop. The air smelled fresh, untouched by the fumes of cities, and the trees grew so thick that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. It felt like we had gone back in time, to a place where the world hadn't been tamed yet. We set up camp by a lake that had no name on the map. It was a quiet, hidden place, surrounded by towering pines and thick undergrowth. The water was still and dark, reflecting the sky like black glass. My grandfather said we'd have no trouble catching fish here. The first day was perfect. We fished in the morning, and by evening we had caught enough trout for dinner. My grandfather cleaned them while I gathered wood for the fire. That night, we ate under the stars, listening to the sounds of the forest. I remember the way the flames flickered against his face, the deep lines in his skin making him look older than he really was. As I lay in the tent later that night, I listened to the forest around me. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you feel small in the world. I didn't know then that it would be the last peaceful night we'd have. The next morning, we found something strange near our campsite. A deer, or what was left of one. Its body had been torn open, the ribs jutting out like broken fingers. The head was missing. Flies buzzed around it, the smell of rot thick in the air. At first, I thought a bear had done it, but my grandfather crouched beside it, his face dark with something I couldn't name. He pointed at the cuts along the ribs, clean, precise. Not the work of an animal. Poachers, I thought. Maybe someone had killed the deer and taken only what they needed. But why leave it so close to our camp? My grandfather said nothing, but I saw the way his eyes kept drifting to the trees, scanning the shadows between the trunks. That was the first time I felt it, the feeling of being watched. The day passed slowly after that. We went fishing again, but my grandfather was different, quieter, more alert. His usual patience was gone, and he kept glancing back at the tree line. That night, as we sat by the fire, he barely spoke. When it was time for bed, he told me to keep my knife close, his voice low and serious. He had brought a rifle, too, something he usually only took when hunting. I didn't sleep well. The forest was louder than before. The sounds I had heard the night before, the crickets, the owls, were gone. Instead, there was a different sound, a slow, steady crunching, footsteps in the undergrowth, I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. They were close, too close, but they weren't coming from just one direction. They were circling us. I wanted to wake my grandfather, but before I could move, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the tent walls, listening to my own breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, my grandfather was already awake when I crawled out of the tent. He was standing by the fire pit, staring at something on the ground. When I walked closer, my stomach dropped. Our cooler was gone. Not just moved, gone. No sign of it anywhere. I looked around the camp, expecting to see it knocked over, maybe dragged off by an animal. But there were no tracks. Nothing. That's when I saw it. My grandfather's hunting knife, the one he always kept strapped to his belt, was lying in the dirt a few feet away. He never left it behind. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. The handle was damp, covered in something dark. Blood. He wiped it off on his pants, his face hard, unreadable. "Pack up," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "We're leaving." I didn't argue. I shoved everything into my bag as fast as I could while my grandfather scanned the woods, his rifle held tight in his hands. We moved fast, following the trail back toward the truck. The forest felt different now, the trees pressing in on us, the silence thick and unnatural. Every few minutes, my grandfather would stop and listen, his grip on the rifle tightening. We weren't alone. The footsteps had returned, following us just out of sight. Sometimes they were close, other times farther away, but they never stopped. Then something new, a sound I will never forget. Breathing, heavy, ragged breathing just beyond the trees. It was deep, slow, deliberate. Not the quick panting of an animal, but something else, something human. My grandfather raised his rifle, scanning the woods. I could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his jaw clenched. Then he did something that scared me more than anything. He grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Run." We ran. Branches whipped at my face. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Behind us, I heard the footsteps quicken, breaking into a sprint. Whoever, whatever was following us was fast. I heard my grandfather fire a shot. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees. The footsteps faltered, then started again, faster this time. The truck was close. I could see the glint of metal through the trees. My grandfather fired again. This time, the footsteps stopped. We reached the truck, and he shoved me inside, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the dirt road, leaving the trees behind. We didn't stop until we were back in town. My grandfather didn't say a word the whole drive. At the gas station in Red Pine, he pulled over and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, but he just shook his head. We never spoke about what happened. A week later, he sold his rifle, stopped hunting, never went back to the woods again. Neither did I, and I never forgot the sound of that breathing in the dark. I was never much of a camper, but when my cousin Brian invited me on a weekend trip deep in the mountains of northern Idaho, I figured it would be a good way to clear my head. I was 28 at the time, stuck in a boring routine, working long hours at a job I didn't care about, and barely seeing the outside of my apartment. A weekend in the woods sounded like a break I needed. We planned for a 3-day trip in mid-October. The weather was getting colder, but not unbearable, and the summer crowds were gone. Brian had been camping all his life, and he swore up and down that he knew of a perfect, secluded spot miles away from any trails. We packed our gear, tent, sleeping bags, food, water, and some basic hunting supplies. Brian always carried a rifle when camping just in case. He wasn't paranoid, but he liked to be prepared. The drive took us 5 hours from Boise, winding through narrow mountain roads until we reached a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. We parked at a small clearing where the trees were thin enough to squeeze the vehicle through. From there, we hiked another 2 hours, pushing deeper into the woods until Brian found the spot he was looking for. It was a small clearing on a slight incline, with thick trees surrounding it on all sides. There was no sign that anyone had camped there before. No fire pit, no footprints, no trash. Just untouched forest. The air smelled clean, the kind of crisp mountain air you don't get in the city. We set up our tent near a fallen tree, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped below the trees. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. That changed on the second night. The first night had been uneventful. We ate, drank, and listened to the sounds of the forest. I slept well, better than I expected, but on the second night, something felt off. I woke up in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., with a strange feeling in my chest. Not fear exactly, just unease. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, and everything was silent. Too silent. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know that nature is never completely quiet. There's always something: crickets, wind, the rustling of small animals. But this? Nothing. No sound at all. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening, but the silence felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. Then, from somewhere in the trees, I heard movement. Slow, deliberate. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer sound like when they move. I know what a bear sounds like crashing through the underbrush. This was different. It sounded like careful footsteps, like someone trying not to be heard but stepping on just enough leaves and twigs to give themselves away. I turned toward Brian's sleeping bag, but I could barely make him out in the darkness. He wasn't moving. I couldn't even hear him breathing. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It wasn't circling us. It was coming straight from one direction, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the trees. Then it stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. Just silence again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a lost hunter, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting. I never heard the footsteps again. By the time the first hint of light crept through the trees, I was exhausted. I must have drifted off at some point because Brian was already up, poking at the fire, looking normal, like nothing had happened. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. Maybe I should have. We spent the day hiking, scouting the area, looking for any signs of wildlife. But the strangest thing was that there was nothing. No animal tracks.
No droppings. No birds. No squirrels.
The whole forest felt empty. We hunted for a few hours, but we saw nothing.
No deer. No rabbits.
Not even a single bird in the sky. Brian joked that we had the worst luck ever, but I could see the confusion in his face. He'd hunted all over these mountains before, and he'd never seen it this dead. That night, I made sure the fire was bigger. I didn't want to be caught in the dark again. It didn't help. I woke up to the sound of something breathing outside the tent. Deep, slow, right outside the thin layer of fabric. I didn't move. The fire was still burning, casting a dim orange glow through the tent walls, but I couldn't see anything. Just the sound of breathing, then a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever, whatever, was out there would hear it. I wanted to wake Brian up, but I was frozen. Couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The breathing got louder. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't hear anything else. Finally, The first light of dawn broke through the trees, and I forced myself to move. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the fire. It was dead, completely, not burned out naturally, smothered like someone had poured dirt over it. Then I saw the tracks, long, deep drag marks in the dirt, starting from the edge of the clearing and leading back into the woods. I woke Brian up. We packed up and left without saying a word. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to, and I haven't been camping since. I don't camp much anymore. Not after that trip in the summer of 2013. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a weekend trip to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I needed a break from the noise of the city. I was 31 back then, single and stuck in a cycle of working, sleeping, and wasting weekends on the couch. My boss kept piling on more responsibilities, and my head felt like it was constantly buzzing. So I figured a couple of nights alone in the woods would do me some good. I picked a spot in the Green River National Forest in Kentucky, far enough from the main roads that I wouldn't have to deal with people, but still close enough that I could get back to my truck within an hour or two if something went wrong. I camped alone before, so I wasn't worried. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I had my phone too, but service was spotty out there, which was fine. I didn't want to be bothered. I parked my truck at a gravel pull-off near an old trailhead. There was no one else around, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. The air was thick and humid, and the smell of damp earth clung to everything. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, cutting through the trees in a winding path. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Birds chirped overhead. Bugs buzzed in the air. It was peaceful. I walked for about 3 hours before I found a good spot. A small clearing, flat and dry, with a stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going as the sun started dipping below the trees. By nightfall, the woods were quiet. Too quiet. I sat by the fire, eating a packet of dried beef and watching the flames flicker. Normally, you hear crickets, frogs, maybe an owl in the distance. But that night, there was nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Put me on edge, but I told myself it was fine. Animals get quiet when there's a predator around, but that just meant a fox or a bobcat was nearby. Nothing I couldn't handle. I stayed up for a while, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. First, I thought it was the wind. My tent rustled slightly, and I could hear the trees swaying. But then I heard something else. A faint, steady crunching sound. Footsteps, not heavy, just light enough that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. I stayed still, my breath slow and quiet. My knife was next to me, within reach. I told myself not to panic. If it was a person, they had no reason to be out here. No reason to come into my camp. If it was an animal, it would move on. The footsteps circled my tent. Slow, careful. Then they stopped. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. My heart pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, just outside my tent. Breathing, slow, deep, right on the other side of the fabric. I gripped my knife tight and held my breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, crunching lightly over the forest floor, fading into the distance. I waited. 10 minutes, 20, an hour, nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came and the forest was normal again. Birds were chirping, bugs were buzzing, sunlight streamed through the trees. It almost felt like I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. My fire was just smoldering coals now. Everything looked the same except footprints. They circled my tent in a slow, careful loop. Human footprints, bare feet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone out here. I packed my things fast. Didn't eat, didn't drink. Just stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my pack, doused the fire, and started hiking back to my truck. I moved fast, faster than I should have with a full pack. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but I didn't. The woods were normal again. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat, breathing hard. I tossed my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before I even turned the key. As I pulled out onto the gravel road, I looked back once, just to be sure. There was nothing there, just trees. But I didn't go back to the woods after that. Not alone, not ever, because somewhere out there, deep in those trees, someone was watching, and they were barefoot. I was never the type of person to believe in bad omens or signs from the universe. But after what happened in the summer of 2018, I started thinking differently. I had been on a solo camping trip in the remote parts of New Mexico, somewhere between the Lincoln National Forest and the flat, desolate stretches of desert. I had done solo trips before, mostly in the mountains of Colorado, but I wanted something different this time. Something quiet where I wouldn't run into anyone for days. I drove out from my home in Arizona, packing enough supplies to last me at least a week. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for desert nights, a cooler filled with food, a portable stove, extra water, and of course, my hunting knife. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I always carried a knife just in case. I found a good spot just before sunset, a flat, open stretch of desert land about 2 miles off a dirt road. No signs of human activity, no tire tracks, no trash. Just the desert and me. I set up camp, built a small fire, and watched as the last bit of sun dipped behind the horizon. The silence was incredible. Just the occasional sound of wind brushing through dry shrubs and the distant howl of a coyote. It wasn't until my third night that things started to feel off. That night, the wind had completely stopped. Not even the usual rustling of brush or the distant hum of insects. Just pure, dead silence. I had a small fire going, sitting beside it and eating a can of chili when I heard something in the distance. A soft crunch, like a boot stepping on dry dirt. I froze. My mind immediately went to an animal, maybe a coyote or a deer, but the sound was too precise, too deliberate. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark landscape beyond the reach of my fire. Nothing, just an endless stretch of desert, empty and motionless. I listened for another minute, holding my breath. Then, another sound. This time it was closer, the unmistakable sound of a footstep. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dirt and shrubs. I kept it there for a few seconds, then swept the light to the left, then the right. Still nothing. My gut told me something was out there, watching, waiting. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had been alone in the desert for days. Solitude can mess with your head. I finished my dinner, threw a few more pieces of wood on the fire, and crawled into my tent. I kept my knife close, just in case. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made my muscles tense up. A few times, I thought I heard something outside my tent, but I convinced myself it was just the wind picking back up. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cool desert air. I stretched, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and took a deep breath. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. I crouched down, inspecting them closely. The prints were deep, fresh, and large. Definitely a man's. Someone had been here, watching me while I slept. My stomach twisted. My brain went into overdrive, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe some rancher checking on his land? No, I had been 2 miles off the nearest dirt road. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I stood up and scanned the horizon, my heart pounding in my chest. The desert was empty. No movement. No sign of whoever had made those tracks. I told myself that maybe they had just been passing through. Maybe they had been just as surprised to see my tent as I was to see their tracks. I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to the back of my mind like a weight. I decided to stay for one more night. I had come out here to get away, and I wasn't going to let some random footprints scare me off. I should have left right then and there. That night, I didn't start a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the darkness, knife in my hand, listening. First, it was quiet, just the occasional breeze. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I stayed absolutely still, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then breathing, right outside my tent. Low, steady breathing. I wanted to move. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Then, a soft scratch against the fabric of my tent. I snapped. I lunged forward, stabbing my knife through the tent wall with all my strength. I heard a sharp gasp, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. I scrambled out of the tent, knife in hand, scanning my surroundings. Nothing, just the desert silent as ever. But there was something on my knife. Blood. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the ground. A trail of fresh blood droplets led away from my tent, disappearing into the night. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into my truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about packing properly. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. As I drove away, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of my campsite, watching me leave. I never went back. I never reported it. What would I even say? That some man had been stalking me in the middle of nowhere? That I stabbed someone but had no proof of who they were or why they were there? But I still think about it. About what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. If I hadn't had my knife. Whoever he was, he had been waiting, watching, and he wasn't just passing through. I've always liked camping alone. There's something about being out in the wild, away from people, just surrounded by nature. It's peaceful, quiet, something I don't get much of back home. I'd been to plenty of places before, but this time, I wanted to go somewhere different, somewhere really remote. I chose a spot in the English countryside, a place far from the usual tourist trails. It was early autumn, the air was crisp, and the trees were starting to turn orange and red. I found a quiet area near a small river, miles away from the nearest town. The land was mostly rolling hills, patches of thick woods, and narrow dirt paths that barely looked used. I parked my car a couple of miles from where I planned to camp and hiked in with my gear. The spot I found was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by trees, close to the water. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down to enjoy the stillness of the place. It was exactly what I wanted. No sounds except the rustling leaves, the occasional bird, and the distant trickle of the river. I spent the day exploring, hiking up a few hills to take in the view. I didn't see a single person. The paths looked like they hadn't been walked on in months. As the sun started setting, I made my way back to camp and got a fire going. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. They weren't mine. At first, I thought maybe I'd just forgotten stepping in that area, but the prints were different from my boots. The treads were deeper, wider. Whoever made them was heavier than me. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had passed through earlier in the day. Maybe a hunter or another hiker. But the thing that stuck with me was that the prints led to my campsite, right to the edge of my fire pit. And then they stopped. There were no prints leading away. I stood there for a while, looking around, listening. The trees cast long shadows in the firelight, and the woods beyond were pitch black. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees, but I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little sound had me on edge. The wind in the trees, a twig snapping. It all felt too close. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to something moving outside my tent. A slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down to just glowing embers, but there was enough light to see shadows shifting against the tent fabric. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps moved around my tent, slow and careful. I thought I heard breathing, then nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't dare move. Eventually, I forced myself to peek out. The fire was almost out, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, scanning the trees with my flashlight. Nothing. But then I saw it. Something in the dirt near my tent. More footprints. They hadn't been there before. Whoever it was had walked right up to my tent, just standing there watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up my things. I wasn't about to spend another night out there. I felt stupid for coming alone, for not bringing anything but a knife to protect myself. As I hiked back to my car, I kept checking behind me. The woods felt different now, like they were hiding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. Then, about halfway back to my car, I saw him, a man, standing between the trees maybe 50 feet away. He wasn't moving, just staring at me. He was wearing dirty, tattered clothes, and his face was pale, almost gray-looking. His hair was wild, unkempt. I couldn't make out his eyes in the shadows, but I knew they were on me. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he tilted his head. I turned and walked as fast as I could without running. My car wasn't far now. I could see the dirt road through the trees. I glanced back. He was gone, but I knew he was still there, watching. I practically ran the last stretch to my car. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking. As I pulled onto the narrow road, I looked in the rearview mirror. The man was standing at the tree line, just watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see him again. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods. Not for a single second. I never used to think twice about sleeping on the side of the road. I've done it more times than I can count. Pull off on a quiet dirt path, set up in the truck bed, and rest for the night. I always had my dog with me, a big German Shepherd mix named Jake. He was the best kind of company, alert, protective, and never complaining when things got rough. This happened in the summer of 2019. I was driving through a long stretch of empty highway in Utah, the kind where you can go hours without seeing another car. I had been on the road all day, pushing through the dry heat, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was too exhausted to keep going. I pulled off onto a dirt road, the kind that looked like it was used by ranchers or hunters. It led about half a mile off the highway into an open patch of desert with small shrubs and dry, cracked ground. I figured it was as good a place as any. No houses, no lights, nothing but quiet. I parked, let Jake out, and stretched my legs. The place was eerily still. No wind, no distant animal noises, just silence. Jake sniffed around, his ears up like they always were in new places, but he didn't seem bothered. That was enough for me. If he wasn't worried, I wasn't either. I set up my sleeping bag in the truck bed, ate a quick meal from a gas station stop earlier, and settled in. Jake curled up beside me, his body warm against the night air. The stars were spread out across the sky like a blanket, and for a while it felt peaceful. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. My body just jolted awake like it knew something my mind didn't. I lay still, listening. The desert was silent, but not the kind of peaceful silence from before. This felt off, like something was nearby, something watching. I turned my head to look at Jake. He was awake too. His ears were stiff, his body tense. His nose pointed toward the darkness beyond the truck. He wasn't growling, but that somehow made it worse. If he had been barking, at least I'd know what direction the threat was coming from. But he was just frozen, staring. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the night, landing on the dry dirt and sparse bushes. Nothing. I swept it back and forth, my heart pounding for a reason I couldn't explain. The land stretched out empty in all directions. Then Jake growled, a low, deep rumble that sent a chill through my spine. I turned the flashlight toward where he was staring. At first, I still didn't see anything, just empty ground and scattered brush. But then I saw movement, slow, deliberate, a figure, crouched low to the ground, blending into the night. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. The way it moved, the shape of it, it was a person. I sat up fast, my hand reaching for the knife I always kept nearby. The figure stayed low, creeping toward the truck from the left side, trying to stay hidden in the darkness. My flashlight wasn't strong enough to make out any details, just the outline of a body moving slowly toward us. Jake was stiff as a board, his eyes locked on the intruder. I could feel his muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. I didn't want to make any sudden moves yet. I needed to see what they were going to do. But then I realized something even worse. There wasn't just one. Out of the corner of my eye, on the opposite side of the truck, another shape moved. Two of them. They had been circling me. A sharp jolt of fear shot through me. This wasn't some lost hiker wandering through the night. This was deliberate. They had been watching me long enough to know when I was asleep, long enough to move into position without making a sound. My breathing felt too loud in my ears. My heart pounded so hard I swore they could hear it. Then, in the heavy silence, I heard the smallest sound, a footstep on dry ground. Close. That was enough. I shot up, yanking my knife out as I did, and shined the flashlight directly at the closest figure. And that's when they moved. They bolted, both of them. One ran back toward the darkness, disappearing behind a cluster of bushes, while the other darted off toward the dirt road, vanishing before I could get a good look. Jake erupted into barking, his body lunging toward them, but they were already gone. I didn't waste time. I jumped into the truck, yanking the door open so fast I nearly ripped it off the hinges. Jake leaped in beside me, still growling, his body stiff with adrenaline. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking, breath coming in gasps as I turned the ignition. The headlights blasted on, flooding the area with light. I scanned the desert, searching, but it was empty again, just an open stretch of nothingness. I floored it. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I shot forward, kicking up dust as I sped back toward the highway. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror over and over, expecting to see them standing there, watching me go. But I never saw them again. I didn't stop driving for hours. I didn't stop until the sun was rising, until I found a busy gas station with people and lights and noise. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never camped on the side of the road again after that, because out there in the middle of nowhere, there's no one to call for help, no one to hear you scream, and sometimes the people watching you are patient. They wait, and if you're not careful, you might not wake up in time. I've spent most of my life working with my hands, cutting trees deep in the woods, far from the city, far from anything. Really, the kind of work that breaks your back and fills your lungs with the smell of wet earth and sawdust. It was 1998, and I was working a contract in a remote stretch of forest in northern Montana, logging old-growth trees that had been marked for removal. It wasn't the safest job, but the pay was good, and I'd done it long enough to know what I was doing. That week, the company had us working night shifts because of some schedule mix-up. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I wasn't going to turn down the overtime either. Night cutting wasn't common, too dangerous with limited visibility, but this was a rush job and the company wanted it done. I was the only one who decided to camp out near the site. Most of the guys stayed at a small motel about an hour away, but I didn't feel like making that drive back and forth every night. I had a sturdy old canvas tent, a propane heater, and enough supplies to last a few days. Besides, I liked the quiet. The first night was uneventful, just the sound of rain pattering against the trees, the steady hum of chainsaws in the distance as the others worked, and the occasional crack of a falling trunk. But the second night, that's when things started to feel wrong. It had been raining all day, the kind of cold, soaking rain that turns the forest floor to mud. I was used to working in bad weather, but that night, the air felt different. Thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My chainsaw had been acting up, sputtering and stalling, so I decided to call it early and head back to my camp. I had set up in a small clearing near a creek, about a 15-minute walk from where we were working. As I made my way back, I noticed something in the mud. Tracks, big ones. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear, but the shape was wrong, too long, almost human-like, but wider, heavier. And they weren't just crossing the path. They were following it. My path. The realization sent a chill through me. Someone or something had been walking the same route I took to my camp. I tried to shake it off. Maybe one of the other guys had wandered out this way, but that didn't make much sense. Nobody else was camping out here, and there was no reason for them to come this far into the woods. I kept walking, my boots sinking into the wet ground, trying not to let my mind get the best of me. The rain was falling harder now, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the distant roar of the creek. When I finally reached my camp, I felt an immediate sense of relief. My tent was still there, untouched. The firewood I had stacked was still neatly piled. Everything looked normal, but as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I set up my propane heater inside the tent, changed into dry clothes, and ate a quick meal. The rain was relentless, hammering against the canvas roof, making it hard to hear anything else. After a while, I lay down in my sleeping bag and tried to get some rest. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate crunch outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer passing through. But then I heard it again. A heavy, measured step. And another. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear the rain dripping off the trees, the wind moving through the branches, but nothing else. No breathing, no shuffling, just silence. I stayed completely still, gripping the handle of my knife so tightly my fingers ached. I thought about calling out, but something deep in my gut told me not to. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. No retreating footsteps, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of the rain. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I stepped out of my tent, my boots sinking into the mud, and looked around. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Deep, heavy footprints circling my tent. They weren't mine. They were too big, too wide, and they came from the forest. Whatever had been out there had walked right up to my tent, stood there for who knows how long, and then left without a sound. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they led off into the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. I packed up my camp that morning. I didn't care if I had to drive an hour back and forth to work. I wasn't spending another night in those woods. The rest of the job went without incident. We finished the contract, packed up our equipment, and moved on to the next site. I never told the others what happened, but I think about it sometimes. About the footprints, about the sound of those slow, heavy steps in the rain. And I wonder if whatever was out there that night was watching me the whole time. Camping had always been something my wife, Sarah, and her sister, Emily, loved doing. I wasn't as into it as they were, but I enjoyed getting away from everything once in a while. This time, they convinced me to go on a weekend trip to a national forest a few hours from home. Emily had picked the spot, somewhere deep in the woods, away from the crowds. She said she wanted real peace and quiet, away from the typical campgrounds. It was late September, so the summer crowds had cleared out, and the air was starting to get cooler. We packed up our SUV with all the camping gear, tent, sleeping bags, food, water, and some basic survival supplies. Sarah was excited. Emily was even more so, and I was just hoping we'd get a good fire going before dark. The drive took us down long stretches of highway, then onto smaller roads that twisted through the forest. Eventually, we turned onto a dirt road that led even deeper into the trees. After about an hour of bouncing along the rough path, we found a clearing that Emily had marked on the map. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, surrounded by thick trees. We set up camp near the tree line. Sarah and Emily handled the tent while I got the firewood ready. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled, and the three of us sat around talking and eating. The woods were alive with the usual sounds: crickets, owls, the occasional rustling in the bushes. I wasn't too worried. Animals were normal out here, but something felt off. It was little things at first. A distant snap of a branch that didn't sound like an animal. A feeling that the trees were watching us. I brushed it off. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the trip. We went to sleep that night in the tent, the forest silent around us. I woke up once in the night, hearing something moving outside, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. I held my breath, listening. Then it stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it was a deer and went back to sleep. The next day, we hiked a few miles into the forest, following an old, overgrown trail. It was beautiful. Tall trees, a small stream running alongside us, everything untouched. But the deeper we went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush, just silence. At one point, Emily stopped, looking down at the dirt path. Footprints, not ours. They were fresh, leading deeper into the woods. They weren't hiking boots either. They looked like old work boots, the kind someone might wear for labor. Sarah and Emily tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. Maybe a hunter, maybe another camper. But something about them unsettled me. They weren't heading to a campsite, just into the trees. We decided to turn back, and for the rest of the hike, I kept checking behind us. That night, back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The fire felt smaller, the trees felt closer. Every sound made my skin crawl. Sarah and Emily didn't seem as worried, but I noticed they kept looking over their shoulders more than usual. Then, around midnight, something changed. A sound. Not an animal, not the wind. A whistle. It came from the darkness beyond the firelight. Slow, deliberate. 3 short notes. We froze. It was answered by another whistle, farther away. Same 3 notes. Someone was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing. Just the endless blackness of the forest. But I knew someone was watching us. I whispered to Sarah and Emily to get inside the tent. We turned off the fire, hoping the darkness would hide us. We sat there in silence, listening. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, circling the campsite. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew we were there. They wanted us to know. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The zipper of our tent. Someone was outside, inches away, pulling at it. I lunged, hitting the side of the tent hard, yelling as loud as I could. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then running. Heavy footsteps crashing through the woods. We waited until dawn before stepping outside. The fire pit was cold, and nothing seemed disturbed, but I knew what I heard. We needed to leave. We packed up quickly, but as we loaded the SUV, Emily froze. She was looking at something in the dirt. More footprints. They circled the tent, over and over, and leading away from our campsite, disappearing into the trees, were dozens more. Like whoever had been out there wasn't alone. Like they had been watching us all night. We drove out of those woods as fast as we could, and we never went back. I never thought much about camping. It wasn't something I did often, but when my friend Sam invited me to a weekend trip in the Peak District, I figured it would be a nice break from work. We weren't hardcore hikers, just 2 guys looking to escape the city for a few nights. We planned to camp deep in the national park, far from any tourist spots. Sam had done some research and found a remote clearing near a small river. It wasn't an official campsite, but wild camping was common in the area. We packed light, just tents, sleeping bags, a gas stove, and enough food for 3 days. I was looking forward to the peace and quiet. The drive from Manchester took a few hours. We parked near a small village and hiked in from there. The trail was rough, cutting through thick woods and rolling hills. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was getting low. The spot was perfect. Flat ground, fresh water nearby, and no signs of other campers. We set up our tents and got a fire going. The first night was uneventful. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant hoots of owls. It was colder than I expected, but nothing unbearable. The next morning, we explored the area. The forest was dense, with twisted trees and thick undergrowth, the kind of place that felt untouched. We found an old, overgrown trail leading up a steep hill. At the top, there were the remains of a dry stone wall, maybe an old farm boundary. From there, we had a clear view of the valley below. It was nothing but trees and hills for miles. By the second night, I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't explain why. The forest just felt off. The silence was different, too heavy, like something was watching us. I didn't say anything to Sam. I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. Not an animal, something bigger. Footsteps. I stayed still, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate. Someone was moving through our campsite. I reached for my torch, but before I could switch it on, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard it again, this time closer, right outside my tent. I flicked on the torch and aimed it at the fabric, expecting to see a shadow. Nothing, but I knew someone was there. The zipper on my tent suddenly shifted, like someone had just touched it. I scrambled for my knife, my heart hammering. Then silence. No movement, no footsteps, nothing. I sat there, gripping the knife, listening to the wind rustling the trees. After a while, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a fox or a badger had brushed against my tent. I forced myself to lie back down and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Sam said he hadn't heard anything. I didn't push it. Maybe I had imagined it. We spent the day hiking again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods felt different. We found a small cave halfway up the hill. Inside, there were old fire remains, charred wood and ash. Someone had been here before, maybe even recently. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was further away, deeper in the woods. A rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, long, slow breaths, in and out. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, Sam noticed something strange. Our food bag had been moved. It was still tied to the tree, but lower than we had left it, like someone had untied it and retied it sloppily. I finally told him about the noises. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably an animal. But I saw it in his face. He wasn't as sure as he sounded. We decided to leave that afternoon. We packed up and started hiking back to the car. The walk felt longer than before. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the woods were empty. When we reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. We threw our gear in the back and climbed in. Sam started the engine, but before we could pull away, I noticed something in the trees. A man, standing just inside the tree line. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the branches, watching us. I opened my mouth to say something, but Sam was already pulling onto the road. I kept my eyes on the trees until we turned a corner, and he was gone. Neither of us spoke on the drive back. I haven't been camping since. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the need to prove something to myself. Or maybe I was just stupid. But one thing I know for sure, I'll never make that mistake again. Started as a dumb idea, something I thought would make for a good story later. Camping out in an old graveyard overnight, just to see what it was like. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, in the woods, in the mountains, even near abandoned buildings, but never in a place meant for the dead. There was something different about that. I found the place a few miles outside a small town I was passing through. It wasn't one of those famous cemeteries with big stone mausoleums and statues. Just a quiet, forgotten graveyard at the edge of some woods, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence with a broken gate. A place where the headstones were cracked, the names barely readable, and the graves were sinking into the ground. It was obvious no one visited anymore. I parked my truck on a dirt road nearby and walked in with my gear. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the uneven ground. It was late fall, and the air had that crisp, dry smell that came before winter. Leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way deeper into the graveyard, looking for a good spot to set up. I found a flat patch of grass near a large tree, far enough from the graves that it didn't feel outright disrespectful. I unrolled my sleeping bag, set up a small campfire, and settled in as the last bit of daylight faded. First, it was peaceful, the quiet kind you only find in places that have been forgotten. No city noise, no people, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I sat by the fire, eating a sandwich and scrolling through my phone. No signal, Not surprising. As the night deepened, the air turned colder. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light on the nearby headstones. I could make out the worn-out names and dates, most from the 1800s, some even older. People who had been dead for so long that no one alive probably even knew they existed. That's when I started to feel it. Not fear exactly, just a strange awareness, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my brain messing with me. Sitting alone in a graveyard at night would make anyone feel weird. I kept my head down, focused on the warmth of the fire, and tried to ignore the feeling. But then I heard it, a soft thud, not loud, not aggressive, but distinct, like something had shifted in the dirt. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness. My fire didn't reach far, just enough to light up the closest graves and the base of the tree. Beyond that, everything was black. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a small animal. A raccoon, maybe. They were everywhere. I shook off the unease and went back to my food. Then it happened again. A dull, heavy sound, closer this time, like something pressing down into soft earth. I sat still, gripping my flashlight. I aimed it toward the noise, sweeping the beam across the graves. The light caught the jagged edges of old tombstones, the gnarled roots of the tree, the uneven ground. Then I saw it, a fresh mound of dirt. I hadn't noticed it before, probably because it was partially hidden behind another grave. But now, in the beam of my flashlight, it stood out. The soil was loose, slightly raised, like it had been dug up recently. I stared at it, trying to understand why it was there. This graveyard was abandoned. No new burials.
No caretakers.
No reason for fresh dirt. Then the ground moved. Not a lot. Just the slightest shift, like something beneath the surface had settled. I felt ice crawl up my spine. I told myself I was imagining it, that the dirt had just shifted naturally, that it was nothing, but my gut knew better. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. Midnight. I wasn't tired, but I suddenly had the urge to get inside my sleeping bag, zip it up, and wait for morning. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. I didn't want to get up and gather more wood. I didn't want to move at all. Then, in the silence, I heard breathing. Not my own. Slow, shallow, close. I turned my flashlight back toward the grave. The dirt looked the same. Nothing had changed, but the sound was still there. I wanted to believe it was the wind, or maybe my own breath echoing in my head. But it wasn't. It was coming from the ground. My chest tightened. I had to get out of there. I didn't care if I looked stupid packing up in the middle of the night. I grabbed my sleeping bag and flashlight, leaving the rest of my gear behind. My hands were shaking as I walked back toward the fence. I tried not to look at the graves around me. Then I heard footsteps. Not behind me, not in front of me, underneath me. A deep, dragging sound, like something heavy shifting just beneath the surface. I ran. I didn't care if I tripped over a gravestone, if I left half my stuff behind. I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, staring into the darkness. I didn't see anything, but I could still feel it, that deep, sinking dread. I didn't sleep. I waited until the sky started to lighten, then forced myself to go back for my gear. Everything was where I left it, except for one thing, the fresh mound of dirt. It was gone. The soil was flat, undisturbed, like nothing had ever been buried there, like it had never been there at all. I grabbed my stuff and got the hell out of there. I never told anyone about that night. I didn't want to hear their theories. I didn't want to be told I imagined it, because I know what I heard. And I know one thing for sure, something was moving under that ground. And I don't think it was dead. Camping has always been something I enjoyed, ever since I was a kid. There was something about the fresh air, the crackling fire, and the peacefulness of the woods that made me feel alive. So when my friend Chris suggested we go camping in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, I didn't think twice before saying yes. It was the summer of 2019, and Chris had found a spot deep in the woods, away from the usual campsites and crowded trails. The area was known for its dense forests, winding trails, and occasional black bear sightings. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and headed out early on a Friday morning. The drive itself took us nearly 6 hours from Charlotte, but we didn't mind. The roads became narrower and rougher as we went deeper into the mountains. Eventually, we had to park the car and hike another mile or so to reach the spot Chris had marked on his map. When we finally arrived, the place was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a nearby stream providing fresh water. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in. The first night was everything I loved about camping. Cooking over the fire, sharing stories, and falling asleep to the sounds of nature. The next day, we decided to explore the area. Chris had brought a detailed topographic map, and we chose a trail that seemed to loop around a small mountain and bring us back to camp by late afternoon. The hike was beautiful, with towering oaks and pines shading our path. Every now and then, we'd spot deer tracks or hear the distant calls of birds. Around midday, we came across an old, abandoned cabin. It was nestled off the trail, hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. The wood was rotting, and the roof had partially collapsed, but curiosity got the better of us. Inside, we found the remnants of someone's life: rusted cans, broken furniture, and a dusty old mattress. There were no signs of recent activity, but it was clear that someone had once called this place home. We left the cabin and continued our hike, but something about that place stayed with me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sense of unease, like we had disturbed something that should have been left alone. When we got back to camp, I noticed small things that seemed off. Our gear was where we left it, but my tent zipper was partially open, and I knew I had closed it that morning. Chris laughed it off, blaming it on the wind or animals. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself I was being paranoid. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. The woods felt different, quieter somehow. The usual sounds of crickets and owls were absent, replaced by a heavy silence. I mentioned it to Chris, but he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just my imagination. After a while, we crawled into our tents. Sleep didn't come easily, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig had me on edge. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be any small animal. My heart pounded as I lay still, barely breathing. The steps circled the tent, then moved toward Chris's tent. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. The steps eventually faded into the woods, leaving me wide awake and terrified. The next morning, Chris seemed oblivious to what had happened. I was tempted to pack up and leave, but pride and the thought of being laughed at kept me from saying anything. We spent the day fishing and exploring a nearby stream. Chris even caught a few trout that we cooked for dinner. The normalcy of the day helped ease my nerves, but as night fell, the uneasy feeling returned. This time, I didn't bother with the campfire. I secured my tent as best as I could and lay awake, listening. The footsteps returned, this time accompanied by the faintest hint of a whistle. It was a simple tune, almost cheerful, but out of place in the dark woods. The whistling stopped near my tent, and I could hear breathing, heavy and ragged, like someone who had been running. I held my breath, clutching the small camping knife I kept by my side. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When Chris finally woke up, I told him everything. His face grew serious, and he admitted that he had heard the whistling too but didn't want to scare me. We decided it was time to leave. Packing up was quick, and the hike back to the car felt longer than it should have. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf setting me on edge. As we loaded the car, I noticed something hanging from a tree near where we had parked. It was a small, handmade figure, woven from twigs and string, almost like a crude doll. The realization hit me that we hadn't been alone out there. Someone had been watching us, toying with us, letting us know we were on their land. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. We never talked about that trip again, and I haven't been camping since. Sometimes I find myself lying awake at night, straining to hear that faint whistle in the distance, wondering if I ever truly left those woods behind. I don't know why I agreed to that trip. Maybe it was the need to get away, to breathe something other than city air, to hear something other than the hum of traffic and distant sirens. Maybe it was just a way to say yes to life for once instead of overthinking everything. But looking back, I wish I'd said no. The plan was simple: a 3-day camping trip deep in the woods of northern Montana. Just me, my old college buddy Jake, and his friend Mark, whom I barely knew but seemed harmless enough. Jake had done plenty of solo camping trips before and assured me we'd be fine. He had all the gear, the maps, the experience. I trusted him. We drove up early in the morning, leaving behind paved roads and cell service. The last gas station was miles back, and by the time we turned onto a dirt road barely wide enough for the truck, I already felt the quiet creeping in. Thick pines closed in on either side, towering over us like silent watchers. The deeper we went, the rougher the road became, until finally, we pulled off near a clearing and killed the engine. It was late afternoon by the time we set up camp. We found a good spot near a small stream, close enough to hear the water but far enough not to worry about flooding if it rained. The tent went up quickly, a fire pit was made, and just like that, we had our little home in the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire, shared a few drinks, and listened to the distant sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the faint hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I didn't sleep well that night. The ground was harder than I expected, and every little noise outside made my mind race. More than once, I thought I heard something moving near the tent. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. Morning came and we set out for a long hike. The terrain was rough, full of steep inclines and loose rocks. The deeper we went, the less familiar the landscape became. Even with the map, Jake had to double-check our path more than once. I trusted him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were wandering too far. By late afternoon, we turned back, tired and sore. The trail looked different on the way back, the shadows longer, the trees more twisted. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, though I didn't know what. Back at camp, things felt normal again. We cooked, rested, and let the exhaustion of the day settle into our bones. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long fingers of darkness across the clearing. We stayed up later than the night before, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. Then we heard it, a snap of a branch. Not close, but not far either. I looked at Jake. He heard it too. Another snap, this time closer. The woods were dense, but we could just make out the shapes of the trees in the dying firelight. Nothing moved. No wind, no animals, nothing. Mark muttered something about it being a deer, but I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the sound. It was the weight behind it. Something heavy, something deliberate. We sat in silence for a long time, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. No more breaking branches, no more movement, just the quiet hum of the forest. Eventually, we crawled into our tent. I didn't sleep well that night either. Day 3 was meant to be a lazy day, just some fishing at the stream, maybe another short hike, but something felt off. The air was thick, heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Even the birds seemed quieter. It was around midday when we noticed it. Footprints, large, deep prints in the dirt near our camp. Too big to be ours, too fresh to be old. We followed them a short way into the woods. They were spaced far apart, like whoever or whatever made them had a long stride. They led deeper into the trees before suddenly stopping. Just stopping. No signs of turning around. No broken branches. No dragged dirt. Like whoever made them had vanished. None of us said much after that. We just packed up, faster than we needed to, shoving things into bags and throwing dirt over the fire. The drive back felt longer, the road rougher. When we finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Cell service came back, and I saw a dozen missed messages from family and friends. I should have felt relieved, but the pit in my stomach remained. We never talked about it afterward, never tried to explain it, but I know what I felt out there. We weren't alone. I needed a break. Life had been stressful, and I wanted to get away for a few days, just somewhere quiet, where I could clear my head. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place where I could camp, enjoy some fresh air, and not have to deal with other people too much. I found a small, privately owned campground about 2 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a big, well-known place, just a family-owned property that allowed campers on their land. The pictures online looked decent enough. Big open fields, thick woods surrounding the area, and a small creek running through part of it. It seemed peaceful. The price was cheap too, which was a bonus. I called the number listed on the site and booked a spot. The woman on the phone, who I assumed was the owner, had a strange tone to her voice. Calm, but in a way that felt off. She spoke slowly, almost like she was choosing her words carefully. Still, I didn't think much of it. Some people are just like that. The drive out was nice, mostly back roads with barely any traffic. As I got closer, the paved roads turned to gravel, and eventually, I was driving on dirt. There were no signs, no clear markers, just a small mailbox with a number that matched the one from the website. The driveway leading in was narrow, surrounded by trees so thick that it almost felt like I was going somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. After a few minutes, the trees opened up, and I saw a house sitting on the edge of the clearing. It was old, with faded white paint peeling off the sides. There was a porch, but the railing was missing in some spots. The windows were dirty, and the front door had scratches running down it like something had clawed at it. I stopped the car, unsure if I was in the right place. There were no other cars, no signs that this was a campground. Just the house and a few rusted-out pieces of farming equipment scattered around. Then the front door opened. The woman who stepped out looked to be in her late 50s or early 60s, thin with graying hair that hung past her shoulders. She wore a long, faded dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. Her face was thin, with sunken cheeks, and she had a way of standing that made her seem taller than she really was. I rolled down my window, and before I could say anything, she waved me forward. I hesitated, but there was no turning back now. I parked and got out, keeping a polite distance. The woman looked at me for a long moment, like she was studying me, before finally giving a small nod. She pointed toward a dirt path leading away from the house and into the trees. "That way," she said. That was it. No welcome, no instructions, just those 2 words. I nodded, grabbed my backpack and gear, and started walking. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. After about 15 minutes, the trees opened up into a small clearing. It wasn't bad. There was enough space for my tent, and the creek ran just a few yards away. The ground was mostly level, and though the area looked like it hadn't been used much, it felt private. I set up my tent, got my sleeping bag inside, and started gathering wood for a fire. As I moved around, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of previous campers. No fire pits, no footprints, nothing. It was like I was the first person to ever set up camp here. That wasn't necessarily weird, but it felt odd, considering this was supposed to be a campground. Most places like this had at least some signs of use, old burn marks, scattered trash, something. As the sun started setting, I got a fire going and made myself some food. The air was cool, and the woods around me had that deep, quiet stillness that only comes in places far from people. It should have felt peaceful, but there was something about the place that kept me on edge. Then, just as the last bit of sunlight faded, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the trail. I turned, expecting to see another camper, but there was no one there. The steps continued, crunching softly against the dirt and leaves, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trail. Nothing, but the sound stopped. I stood there for a while, listening, but all I heard was the crackling of my fire. Eventually, I shook it off and sat back down. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me. I didn't sleep well. The woods were too quiet, and every small sound made me sit up, listening. I kept my knife close, just in case. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly, feeling like something was watching me. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining my ears. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, just outside my tent. Something was moving around, slow and careful. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the entrance of the tent. The light barely made it through the thin fabric, but I could see a faint shadow. Someone was standing there, not moving, just standing. I held my breath, waiting for them to say something. Maybe it was the woman from the house, maybe another camper, someone with a reason to be here, but they just stood there. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow shifted. The footsteps started again, moving away from my tent, slow and steady, back toward the trail. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When morning came, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear, ready to leave, but before I went, I walked toward the creek to refill my water bottle. That's when I saw something. A little farther down the bank, near the tree line, there was a hole. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small grave, but the dirt was fresh, like it had been dug recently. Next to it was a shovel, and on the shovel was a single word, scratched into the metal. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and started walking, fast. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the house, the woman was standing on the porch, watching me. She didn't say anything, didn't ask why I was leaving early. She just smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one that told me she knew exactly what I had seen. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove off. I never looked back.